What if a worn-down soldier believed he had nothing left to give until a loyal dog led him to a secret that could save an entire town?
What is it, boy?
What if a
What do
crumbling
you
stone
see?
house whispered the truth about lives lost long ago, and one man had to decide whether to walk away or fight for justice? This is the journey of Jake and Max, a story of struggle, hope, and a town learning to breathe again through the courage of two faithful hearts. I hope you enjoy this story, filled with healing and new beginnings. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The morning sky over Maple Hollow was wrapped in a thin layer of gray clouds that softened the sunlight and gave the small valley a muted calm. A light breeze carried the scent of pine and old chimneys, drifting between the narrow streets and the aging rooftops. The town felt half awake, the kind of place where dawn rose slowly and carefully, touching everything in silence. Jake Turner walked down the cracked sidewalk with a steady but tired gait. He was a man about 40 years old, with shoulders shaped by years of lifting heavy equipment and a quiet strength earned from long tours overseas. His face carried the sharp lines of someone who had spent too many nights awake, and his dark blonde hair had begun to fade at the edges from sun and stress. A faint stubble always shadowed his jaw, as if he no longer cared enough to shave clean every morning. His eyes were a subdued blue, the color of water under thick ice, calm at first glance, but hiding a weight that he seldom voiced. Jake worked as a machine repairman at an auto shop in town, a low-wage job that kept him on his feet for long hours. The work was honest, but draining, and he often returned home with his hands stained with grease and his body aching in familiar ways. Despite his strength, there was a slow heaviness in his walk, as if each step carried memories from a battlefield far from Maple Hollow. His life after the service had not unfolded with ease. Bills gathered faster than income, and his small rented room above a shuttered laundromat felt more like a temporary shelter than a home. But Jake endured it all with a quiet discipline. He had learned long ago that surviving did not always look heroic. Sometimes it simply meant showing up again the next morning. Beside him walked Max, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a strong build and a thick coat of tan and black fur. Max had been rescued from a shelter 2 years earlier, and from the moment Jake laid eyes on him, the dog had carried an unusual calm. His ears stood alert, and his amber eyes reflected a keen intelligence that made him seem almost able to read Jake's thoughts. Max walked close to Jake's side, matching his pace with effortless loyalty. He had a steady temperament and a deep sensitivity to Jake's moods. Whenever Jake's thoughts darkened, Max moved closer, brushing his head against Jake's hand, as if reminding him he was not alone. Jake pushed open the old wooden door to the stairwell that led to his rented room. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and old paint. He climbed the stairs, feeling the stiffness in his knees flare in small sparks of pain. When he reached the landing, he paused to rest his hand against the wall. He did not complain. He had spent years learning to swallow pain without comment. Once inside his room, he set his worn canvas jacket on the chair, and Max circled twice before lying on the thin rug near the window. The quiet settled in with its usual weight. Jake took a deep breath, trying to stretch the tightness in his chest. Another day survived, he thought. Then the apartment buzzer sounded. A sharp tone cracked the silence. Max lifted his head instantly, ears pricked. Jake frowned. He received few visitors, and none arrived unannounced. He moved to the intercom and pressed the button. A delivery worker spoke through the static, announcing he carried a certified letter for Jake Turner. Jake went downstairs, Max following closely. The worker handed him a cream-colored envelope and left without conversation. The envelope bore the seal of a law office from another state. Jake felt an unexpected pressure in his chest, a quiet alarm that made his fingertips tremble as he broke the seal. He unfolded the letter slowly, scanning the dense lines until a few sentences reached out and struck him with full force. His former commanding officer, Captain Elias Ward, had passed away. Jake stared at the words until they blurred slightly. Captain Ward had been a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deep voice and an unwavering sense of responsibility. His presence on the battlefield had always felt like a shield, steady and unbreakable. The man had shaped Jake during the hardest years of his life, guiding him with firm discipline and rare kindness. Losing him felt like a link to his past had snapped without warning. But the shock did not end there. The letter stated that Jake was named as the sole heir to a property left behind by Captain Ward, a property located on the outskirts of Maple Hollow. A stone house that locals seldom approached, a house often spoken of in whispers. Jake lowered the letter and let the silence settle heavily around him. He could feel Max leaning gently against his leg, as if sensing his confusion. Jake returned to his room and sat on the edge of the bed with the letter still in his hands. He tried to steady his breathing. The idea of inheriting anything felt strange. He had nothing of value himself. The thought that Captain Ward had chosen him created a mix of gratitude and discomfort. Jake had never thought of himself as someone worthy of such trust. He felt undeserving, even unprepared. Memories flickered through his mind. Nights crouched beside Ward in ruined buildings. Moments when Ward had spoken to him like a mentor rather than a superior. The way Ward had looked at him after they lost a friend in the field, with quiet understanding rather than blame. Jake closed his eyes and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Why me? He thought, though without using the words aloud. He looked down at Max, who had settled again at his feet. The dog watched him steadily, patient and grounding. Jake reached down and rested his hand on Max's head, feeling the warmth of his loyal companion. The letter included instructions for claiming the house and a note that a representative from the law office would contact him soon. He read the final lines again, letting the reality sink deeper. The stone house stood at the edge of Maple Hollow. Some said it was cursed. Others said strange things happened there. No one ever stayed long. Jake did not believe in curses, but he believed in hardship, and he believed in the weight that history sometimes pressed upon a place. He also believed in duty, even when it confused him. Captain Ward had trusted him. That alone meant he would not walk away. Jake stood slowly, feeling new tension settle in his back. He looked at Max, who was still waiting with soft eyes. "We will see it tomorrow," Jake said, in his mind without speaking. Max lifted his head as if he could hear it anyway. Jake folded the letter carefully and placed it on the small table beside the bed. Outside, the clouds thickened and the dull light dimmed. In that room, above the empty laundromat, Jake Turner felt the first pull of a path he did not choose, but one he sensed he must follow. The stone house waited, silent and unmoving, holding its secrets close. Jake felt unease rise within him, but beneath it flickered something else, a faint thread of purpose, fragile but real. Max shifted closer and rested his head against Jake's boot. Jake let out a long breath and gently touched the dog's back. Whatever waited in that house, they would face it together. For now, he let the quiet settle again, unaware of how deeply his life was about to change. The afternoon sky over Maple Hollow was pale with thin drifting clouds and a faint wind that smelled of damp soil and fallen leaves. The air was cool but not harsh, and the light was soft across the quiet roads that led toward the outer edge of the town. The season felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. Jake Turner guided his old truck along the narrow lane that followed the tree line. Max sat in the passenger seat with his head slightly raised and his alert amber eyes watching the passing scenery. Jake kept his focus on the road, but attention pulled at him. The letter from the day before remained folded in his jacket pocket, and its meaning pressed heavily against him. Inheriting anything felt surreal, yet here he was, driving toward a property that had once belonged to a man he deeply respected. Jake tried to steady his breathing, but his thoughts churned with unease. As the truck rounded a bend, the stone house finally came into view. It stood alone on a patch of uneven ground, surrounded by wild grass that reached almost to Jake's knees when he stepped out. The house was built entirely of gray stone blocks, which gave it a cold and solemn appearance. Many stones were cracked and discolored. Some had shifted out of alignment from age and weather. The roof had wide patches where tiles had fallen away, leaving jagged openings like missing teeth in an old face. The window frames leaned slightly, and the glass panes were clouded with long streaks of dirt. Ivy had grown up one entire wall in tangled ropes, and the yard bore no sign of recent human care. Jake approached the front steps with careful movements. The air felt still around the property in a way that made him pause, as if he had stepped into a forgotten corner of time. The weight of the past hung in the silence. Max stepped ahead of Jake and sniffed the ground with slow deliberation. His tail stood low but steady, and his posture showed no hesitation. The dog walked confidently up the steps and waited for Jake at the door, as if reassuring him without words. Jake pushed the door open. It resisted slightly from years of neglect, but finally gave way with a long scraping sound. The interior was dim. Dust lingered in the air, catching the faint light from the doorway. Jake stepped inside and felt the wood floor flex beneath his weight. The hallway smelled of cold stone mixed with the musty scent of old fabric and untouched rooms. He took another step, then paused again. This house did not welcome him, nor did it threaten him. It simply existed in quiet abandonment. As Jake walked from room to room, he noticed how each space carried the same sense of waiting. The living room held an empty fireplace and a few collapsed shelves. The walls were stained by water and time. The ceiling sagged in places, and cobwebs traced long arcs between beams. But there was something else beneath the decay. A sense of stories left unfinished. Jake felt a faint pull inside him, a tug of responsibility he had not expected. He entered the kitchen. The stone walls here were darker and the windows smaller. The room was bare, except for a long wooden counter warped by age. Max followed closely, then suddenly stopped. The dog lowered his head and stared fixedly at one corner of the floor. Jake frowned. He stepped closer and noticed an old wooden trapdoor set into the floorboards. Its edges were worn smooth, but a heavy iron lock secured it. The surface of the trapdoor was covered in scratches that did not match the surrounding wear. Jake knelt and brushed away the dust. then touched the lock. It was cold and solid. Max stayed beside him, tense, but not afraid. He sniffed around the trapdoor and let out a quiet rumble deep in his chest. Not a warning, but a recognition. The dog pressed his paw lightly against one edge, then looked up at Jake with intense focus, as if urging him to understand. Jake felt unease stir within him again. He remembered the rumors spoken in town about the stone house. People said it was unlucky. People said strange things had happened here. People said the house had a history that reached into the foundations. Earlier that day, Jake had stopped briefly in the town square to ask for directions. A few townspeople had approached with curious glances. One older woman with thin gray hair and a face marked by deep wrinkles had spoken first. Her back was slightly bent from years of work, and her eyes were narrow but sharp. Her voice carried a mix of politeness and caution. She told Jake she had lived in Maple Hollow all her life, and that the stone house had always been known as a place where trouble settled. She mentioned that many owners never stayed long. Her tone carried sympathy when she realized Jake was the new inheritor. She had said softly that he was unfortunate to receive such a burden. Jake had listened without reacting. He was used to hardship and used to others assuming he could endure what they would avoid. But now, standing above a locked trapdoor in a house with its own silent story, he felt something tighten inside his chest. He wondered what Captain Ward had known. He wondered why Ward had chosen him as the heir to a place like this. Jake felt confusion rise, but also a quiet determination. The man who had trusted him in the past must have believed he was capable of facing whatever waited in these walls. Jake straightened and stepped backward. Max followed, but his attention kept pulling toward the trapdoor. The dog paced once, then settled near the kitchen entrance, but kept his gaze locked on the floor, as though sensing a presence hidden beneath the stones. Jake watched him with a mix of worry and curiosity. Max had always been perceptive. Jake recalled how the dog reacted to sounds before Jake even heard them, how he sensed fear in Jake's silence on difficult nights. If Max was focused so intensely on that trapdoor, there had to be a reason. Jake's thoughts grew heavier as he walked through the rest of the house. He imagined what people in town must have believed when they heard he had inherited this place. Zao. So. Unlucky. He could almost hear their pity. A veteran burdened by life, now burdened by a ruin. Jake did not resent them. He understood why they said it. The house looked like a monument to abandonment. Yet Jake felt something stirring under his fatigue. A spark of resistance, perhaps even purpose. He stood beside a broken window and looked out at the overgrown yard. The wind moved slowly across the grass and through the trees at the edge of the property. The world felt paused. Max joined him and nudged his hand. Jake rested a palm gently on the back of the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth that grounded him. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. He did not know what secrets this house held, or why Max reacted so strongly to the trap door, but he felt a pull to understand it. Something waited beneath the quiet stones and shadowed corners. Something that had not yet revealed itself. But not today, Jake thought silently. Today was only the beginning. He would face the hidden part of the house when he was ready and when daylight gave him strength. For now, he would accept the weight he had inherited and the path that came with it. Max pressed his head lightly against Jake's leg, as if to confirm that they would face it together. Jake stepped outside again, letting the cool wind calm him. He took one last look at the stone house. It stood silent and unmoving like a relic of a forgotten past. Behind its walls, he sensed more than decay. He sensed intent. He sensed something that waited for someone to listen. And whether he wanted it or not, Jake Turner was now that someone. Night settled over Maple Hollow with a slow and deliberate stillness. The air outside the stone house was cool and thin, carrying the faint scent of distant pine trees and damp soil. A weak moon hung behind drifting clouds, casting a dim silver tone across the uneven yard. The wind moved in quiet breaths through cracks in the stone walls and along the neglected edges of the roof. Inside the house, the darkness felt heavier than the night itself, as though the walls had absorbed decades of silence and were now releasing it in long, slow whispers. Jake Turner sat on the old wooden chair he had dragged into the front room earlier that day. The chair creaked under his weight as he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together. He felt the ache in his back settle deeper as fatigue pressed down on him. The day had drained him more than he wanted to admit. He had spent hours walking through the abandoned rooms, studying the dust-coated shelves and the long cracks running like scars through the walls. Now, the quiet pressed against him from all sides, making him feel exposed in a way he had not expected. Max lay near the doorway, with his front paws stretched forward and his head lifted alert. His ears twitched with each groan of the house. His amber eyes reflected the faint moonlight slipping through the window. The dog looked calm, but focused, always ready to rise. Jake rubbed his forehead, trying to ease the rising tension. He had believed that settling inside the house for one night would strengthen his resolve. Instead, he felt the familiar tightness of old memories squeezing into his ribs, the kind of pressure that made his breath shallow. On battlefields far from here, nights had often been the most difficult, not because of the noise, but because of the silence that came before danger. Now, sitting in this forgotten stone house, he felt the same old instinct whispering that something unseen was drawing closer. He closed his eyes for a moment, but sleep did not come. His mind wandered back to events he tried not to relive. Flashing light, shaking ground, the weight of dust and fear mixed with the heavy ringing in his ears. The kind of chaos that left more than scars on the body. Max shifted slightly, and Jake opened his eyes again, focusing on the present. He reminded himself that he was not on a battlefield anymore. He was only in an old house in a town that did not know his past and did not ask for it. But the quiet did not soothe him. It wrapped around him in a heavy coil. Then he heard it. A sound rising faintly through the wooden floorboards beneath him. Metal dragging. A low scrape that traveled upward through the bones of the house. Jake froze. The sound came again, slow and uneven, as if something heavy brushed against a hidden surface below. His pulse spiked immediately. His fingers curled into tight fists. He forced himself to breathe evenly, but his mind flashed back to metal grinding beneath collapsing structures on old missions. The sound in the house was quieter, but carried the same sharp tone that made his skin prickle. Max lifted his head fully, his body instantly alert. He did not bark. Instead, he stood slowly, his posture steady and controlled. His gaze locked toward the kitchen where the trapdoor waited. The metal sound rose again, and behind it came another noise. A thin wail of wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but shaped strangely by the house. It echoed through the narrow hallway with a tone that almost resembled a distant cry. Jake felt a chill run across his spine. His breath grew shallow. For a moment, he considered grabbing his jacket and leaving the house behind for good. He had done his best to follow duty all his life. He had endured the memories that came home with him, but this was different. This was a place with its own past, a place where he did not know what waited in the dark beneath him. He stood slowly, feeling the stiffness in his knees return. The floor felt colder as he walked toward the kitchen. Max moved ahead of him, taking steady steps and pausing only once to glance back at Jake as if guiding him. The dog stopped at the trapdoor and lowered his head. His nose touched the wood, and he sniffed intently. Then he pressed his paw lightly against the edge in the same quiet way he had done earlier that day. Jake swallowed hard. The metal dragging sound came once more, vibrating faintly beneath them. He felt his heart thudding against his ribs, as if trying to climb higher into his throat. The wind outside grew stronger, sending a sighing tone through the cracks in the stone walls. It mingled with the faint scrape below, making the house feel alive with old grief. Max looked up at Jake, his eyes steady and clear. There was no fear in them, only a determined focus that struck Jake deeply. The dog stepped back slightly, then sat with straight posture, his gaze fixed on the trapdoor. Jake felt a tremor move through him. He had seen this look in Max before, on nights when Jake could not steady his breathing, and Max would quietly place himself between Jake and the dark corners of the room. The dog had always sensed things he could not explain. Now the same awareness echoed in Max's eyes, as if telling Jake that this house was not haunted by superstition, but by something real, hidden deep below. Jake took a step back, pressing his palm against the wall to steady himself. The sensation of exhaustion mixed with fear surged through him. Every part of him wanted to open the front door and walk into the night, leaving the house and its secrets behind. He had spent too many years fighting battles not his own. He had endured enough loss to fill a lifetime. Why should he face another burden now? Why risk himself again? Why stay in a place that already felt like a tomb filled with echoes? The metal scrape rose once more, softer this time, but unmistakable. Jake inhaled sharply. Sweat gathered at his temples. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again. The kitchen looked the same, dim, dusty, silent except for the faint settling of the house. Max remained seated at the trapdoor, unwavering in his quiet insistence. Jake felt his breath slow slightly as he stared at the dog. Max was not afraid. Max was not confused. Max simply knew something lay beneath the floor, something that mattered. Jake raised a hand and ran it across the back of his neck. His skin was tight with tension. He glanced toward the front door again, imagining the night air and the relief of walking away. But then a different feeling rose inside him, a tired but growing resolve. He had been trusted with this house for a reason. He had survived too much to retreat from a sound in the dark. His fear was real, but so was the sense that something in this house waited for him to uncover it. The thought tightened in his chest. Familiar, heavy, purpose. Still, Jake knew he was not ready tonight. The memory stirred by the noises had shaken him too much. His hands still trembled slightly. He needed rest. He needed morning light. He needed clarity. He stepped back from the trapdoor and whispered a quiet breath. Not tonight. Max stood and pressed his side gently against Jake's leg, offering silent reassurance. Jake rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling steady warmth push back against his fear. The metal sounds had faded now, replaced by the low murmur of wind outside. The house returned to stillness, though now the silence seemed fuller, holding secrets that waited for dawn. Jake walked back toward the front room and sat again in the wooden chair. Max lay near him, but closer than before, as if guarding him. Jake drew a slow breath and looked at the dark, shadowed ceiling. Sleep still would not come, but his heartbeat eased one beat at a time. He did not understand this house. He did not understand the noises, but he understood Max's reaction, and that alone kept him from leaving. The dog had chosen the trapdoor with certainty, as if to say, "This is where it begins." Jake glanced once more toward the kitchen, then closed his eyes. He would face it soon, but not tonight. A pale morning light spread across Maple Hollow under a thin blanket of mist. The air was cool and quiet, carrying the smell of wet earth and fading autumn leaves. Soft gray clouds drifted low above the town, and the streets stirred slowly as if waking from a long, uneasy sleep. Jake Turner walked along the narrow sidewalk, with Max at his side, heading toward the town library. The restless night still clung to him, and the sounds he had heard beneath the house echoed faintly in his thoughts. He kept his shoulders tense and his gaze lowered, as though trying to steady himself through the rhythm of each step. Jake pushed open the door of the library. The building was old, with tall windows and wooden floors polished by decades of footsteps. The interior smelled of old pages and binding glue, mixed with the quiet warmth of a place used for patient study. Light filtered through the windows in soft ribbons, landing across tables filled with faded books. The space felt calm and orderly, a stark contrast to the confusion carried inside Jake's mind. Behind the main desk sat the town librarian. His name was Walter Grayson. He appeared to be around 70, with a slender build and a posture slightly curved from years spent leaning over books and catalog drawers. His hair was thin and white, brushed neatly backward to reveal a long forehead and gentle facial angles softened by age. His eyes were pale blue behind simple rounded glasses and held a quiet intelligence shaped by a lifetime spent among stories and records. His clothing was plain, a brown sweater worn over a collared shirt. His movements were deliberate and calm, and his voice when he spoke carried a softness that made people feel safe to ask questions. Yet beneath his kind demeanor, there was a sharpness, an ability to remember details and see connections that others overlooked. He was known in town as a man who valued truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Jake approached the desk slowly. Walter looked up and offered a small nod of greeting. Jake cleared his throat before speaking, unsure of how to begin. He explained that he had recently inherited the stone house at the edge of Maple Hollow, and that he wished to understand its past. Walter listened with quiet attentiveness, his gaze steady on Jake's face, as if evaluating both the spoken words and the weight behind them. When Jake finished, the librarian folded his hands on the desk and studied him for a moment. Then he motioned for Jake to follow him toward a long table near the archive shelves. His steps were slow but firm, and his expression thoughtful. Walter told Jake that the history of the stone house was not simple. He said the property had been tied to an old quarry that once operated on the outskirts of town. His voice remained even yet carried an undertone of sadness. Walter retrieved several folders and newspapers from a storage drawer. He laid them out carefully on the table, smoothing the edges as though handling something fragile. Jake felt a slight tremor in his hands as he reached for the first newspaper. Max had settled beneath the table, stretching his legs forward and resting his chin on his paws, but his eyes followed every movement Jake made. The newspaper was dated more than 30 years earlier. Jake scanned the headline: Quarry collapse claims multiple lives. The article described a sudden cave-in that had buried workers under tons of stone. The official story blamed the quarry manager. Jake read each sentence slowly, letting the printed words settle into him. As he read, he felt a tight pull in the center of his chest. The tragedy felt distant, yet strangely connected to the cold atmosphere of the stone house. Walter explained that the accident had shaken the town for years. The quarry had closed shortly after the collapse. The company that owned it had withdrawn from Maple Hollow, leaving behind unemployment and deep resentment. Yet Walter's voice grew more pointed as he spoke. He said that some townspeople believed there had been more to the story than what the newspapers reported. Jake looked through another stack of documents. Some were company records photocopied from old archives. Others were newspaper clippings yellowed with age. A pattern began to emerge. Before the quarry closed, the same company had bought the stone house. Not for housing, but for storage and administrative use. Yet after the collapse, the property seemed to lose its purpose and was eventually abandoned. Jake felt his pulse shift as he leaned closer over the papers. The idea that the house held a link to a forgotten tragedy unsettled him in a deep and quiet way. As Jake continued reading, Max suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood rigid and alert. His amber eyes were focused sharply on Jake's hands. Jake paused and noticed that he had reached the section describing the details of the collapse: broken support beams, faulty reinforcing materials, workers trapped as the quarry walls fell. Max rose slowly and stepped closer, his nose brushing against Jake's knee. His eyes held an intensity that made Jake feel as though the dog sensed more than merely the tone of the article. Max let out a low breath through his nose, his tail still, but his posture alert. Jake looked at Max with a growing heaviness. Something about the dog's reaction pierced through him. Every time the article mentioned the collapse, Max seemed to shift in quiet alarm, as though the injustice of the event vibrated in the room. Jake felt a tightness in his throat. He had seen too much senseless loss in his own life. He knew how many stories never reached the ears of those who could change them. He wondered how many lives had been shattered here long before he ever stepped foot in Maple Hollow. Walter continued speaking, softly, describing how the collapse had been blamed on the quarry manager, who was said to have ignored safety concerns. However, the librarian leaned forward slightly and whispered that some believed the official story had been shaped to protect the company rather than reveal the truth. His pale blue eyes sharpened in a way that suggested he had carried this suspicion for many years. Jake felt a heavy pressure spreading across his chest. The past of the stone house did not feel distant anymore. It felt close, present, as if the walls of the house still carried the echoes of those buried beneath the quarry. The idea unsettled him, but also awakened something he had not felt in a long time: a sense of responsibility, a pull toward truth, a whisper of purpose. Max sat beside him now, perfectly still, his eyes bright and fixed. Jake reached down and brushed his fingers lightly along the dog's back. The contact steadied him. Max had always sensed things with unexplainable certainty. Now his presence felt even more significant, as though the dog understood that the path Jake was stepping onto was more than curiosity. It was connected to something unresolved, something waiting. Jake closed the last folder slowly. His breathing was shallow but steady. He thanked Walter, who nodded with a quiet seriousness. The librarian watched him with a knowing gaze, as if recognizing that Jake was now carrying a piece of town history that had long been buried. Jake walked out of the library with Max close to his leg. The air outside was cool, and the mist had lifted slightly. Light filtered through the clouds, casting soft shadows across the street. Jake felt the weight of what he had read pressing through him. The stone house was not merely abandoned. It was tied to grief, to injustice. And though he did not understand why fate had brought him here, he sensed that turning away would not be easy. Max pressed his head gently against Jake's hand. Jake looked down at him and felt a flicker of resolve. Whatever waited beneath the floor of that house had roots deeper than he imagined, and Max had already sensed it. The afternoon sky hung low over Maple Hollow, filled with soft gray clouds that muted the sunlight. A cool breeze moved across the fields and touched the distant treetops with slow, gentle motions. The air carried a quiet stillness, the kind that made each sound inside the old stone house feel sharper and heavier. Jake Turner stepped through the doorway with Max close to his leg, his boots scraping lightly across the worn wooden floor. He felt a weight in his chest, but also a steady pull of determination as he walked deeper into the house. The visit to the library lingered in his thoughts, and so did the way Max had reacted to the stories of the quarry collapse. Something in Jake's mind had shifted. He no longer saw the stone house as only a burden. It had become a place with ties to a hidden story, and Max seemed to understand that before he did. The living room was dim, with narrow beams of light sliding through cracks in the shutters. Dust floated slowly in the air like drifting ash. Jake set down his tools near the middle of the room. The walls were bare stone, uneven, and aged with long, dark streaks from years of water and neglect. He exhaled deeply and placed his hand on one wall, feeling the cold hardness of the stone. He reminded himself that he had come back today for a reason. Max moved around the room with careful steps, sniffing at corners, then circling back toward Jake. His ears flicked with each sound the house made, but his posture remained calm and purposeful. Jake knelt beside a section of the wall and started scraping away loose mortar. His movements were tired, but steady. Working with his hands always gave him a sense of direction, and today he needed that more than usual. His mind still pulsed with memories of the old newspaper articles and the faces of workers he never knew but felt connected to. Men buried in stone and dust, while blame was placed on someone who may not have been at fault. Jake felt anger surface quietly within him, a deep, slow burn that reminded him of soldiers he had lost due to failures far above them. He was not sure if the truth lay here in this house, but he felt closer to it than ever. Max suddenly stopped moving. His body tensed as he turned sharply toward the far left wall. His nails clicked softly on the floor as he walked toward it with focused steps. Jake paused and watched him. Max stood before the wall, his head low and his nose brushing the stone. Then he lifted one paw and struck lightly against it. A soft sound filled the room. Max let out a short, deep bark, not loud, but firm, as though announcing something certain. Jake felt his heartbeat rise. He stood slowly and approached the dog. He placed his hand on the same wall and knocked lightly. The sound echoed back with a hollow tone. Jake felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, controlled breath. Hollow meant space, hidden space behind the stones. His pulse grew stronger. He knocked again once, twice, listening carefully. The sound was unmistakable. Something lay behind this wall, and Max had known it long before he did. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and reached for the tools. He felt a faint trembling in his fingertips, not from fear, but from the weight of possibility settling over him. Working carefully, he pried loose the first stone. It came away slower than he expected, the mortar resisting, but not fully solid. Behind it was darkness. He removed another stone, then another, forming a narrow opening. Dust filled the air, and he turned his face away, coughing quietly. Max stood close, watching each movement with unwavering attention. The opening widened until Jake could see inside a small cavity built behind the main wall. It was just large enough to hold an object. Something metal glinted faintly in the dim light. Jake reached inside and pulled it toward him. A heavy iron box covered in a thin layer of moisture-resistant coating. The corners were reinforced, and the lid fit tightly as though sealed against time. Jake set it gently on the floor and brushed away the dust. His breath felt unsteady, but he continued with calm hands. He opened the lid. Inside were stacks of old papers, bound with string, and a thick handwritten journal. Each page was yellowed, but well preserved. The ink, though faded, was still readable. Jake lifted the journal slowly, feeling the weight not only of the object, but of the history locked within it. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and opened the first page. Max lowered himself beside Jake, resting his chin on Jake's knee, as if understanding that what lay inside these pages mattered deeply. The journal belonged to the quarry manager from decades earlier. The entries were written in a careful hand that grew increasingly uneven toward the later pages. Jake read silently, his eyes narrowing with each word. The manager described structural concerns ignored by the company. Requests for better support, beams denied. Materials replaced with weaker ones to save money. Complaints silenced by orders from higher positions. Jake felt pressure gather in his chest as he continued. Every page revealed more evidence that the collapse had not been a simple accident. It had been preventable. It had been caused by decisions made far from the quarry floor. Jake's jaw tightened as he reached the final entries. The pages described the manager's fear that he would be blamed for the collapse. His notes hinted at pressure from the company to sign documents clearing them of fault. He refused. Then he wrote that he hid the journal in the stone house, hoping someone someday would uncover the truth. His last lines were shaky, almost unreadable. Jake could feel the despair in them. A man defeated not by stone, but by silence. Jake closed the journal slowly. A heavy quiet settled in the room. Max looked up at him with steady eyes. Jake ran a hand across the dog's head, feeling both gratitude and heaviness. Max had guided him to the wall. Max had sensed something here. Jake felt the familiar rise of responsibility inside himself, something he had tried to bury long ago. He did not know what he would do next, but he knew this truth could not stay hidden any longer. The house no longer felt empty. It felt like a witness, and Jake Turner felt the weight of its story settle into him like a duty he had been chosen to bear. The morning sky over Maple Hollow was a pale, muted blue, with thin clouds drifting slowly across the light. The air held the crisp chill of early autumn, and a faint scent of fallen leaves moved through the town. Jake Turner stepped outside the stone house, with Max walking calmly at his side. The secrets revealed in the journal had settled heavily in Jake's thoughts, through the night pressing against memories he wished had faded long ago. Now, he carried a folder filled with copies of the documents found behind the wall, a small but powerful weight that seemed to steady his resolve. Jake drove toward a nearby town where an old friend worked as an attorney. The man was Daniel Reeves, a former Army legal officer who had served in the same division years ago. Daniel was in his mid-40s, with short dark hair streaked lightly with gray and a square jaw that gave him an air of stern patience. His eyes were a sharp, steady brown, framed by lines that hinted at long years of paperwork, stress, and unspoken grief shared with soldiers he had advised. He wore a simple gray suit that fit him loosely, as if it was something he tolerated rather than chose. His manner was quiet but firm, and he greeted Jake with a slow nod filled with recognition that needed no words. Inside the small office, Jake spread the documents across Daniel's desk. The room smelled of old paper and strong coffee, and Max rested near the chair, watching both men with alert eyes. Jake explained everything from the discovery behind the wall to the history of the quarry collapse. He kept his voice steady, but each sentence seemed to awaken buried emotions. He remembered the sound of shrapnel tearing through vehicles, the quiet shock on the faces of men he could not save. Negligence was not a new enemy to him. It had followed him across continents and battlefields. Now he saw its mark again in Maple Hollow, hidden beneath polite silence and corporate distance. Daniel listened without interruption. His face grew harder with each page he read. When he finally looked up, he exhaled slowly. He spoke in a low, even voice, saying that the evidence was credible and dangerous for the corporation. He arranged the documents into a neat stack and placed them in a sealed envelope. He promised to keep the copies secure and advised Jake to stay cautious. Jake felt a familiar tightening in his chest, like the moments before a mission when the outcome had too many unknowns. But he nodded. He had come too far to turn back. After leaving the office, Jake drove to the city where the headquarters of the Modern Mining and Development Corporation stood. The drive was long and silent. Max rested his head on Jake's arm whenever the truck slowed, as if sensing the pressure growing inside his owner. Tall glass buildings rose on the horizon, cold and perfect in their symmetry. Jake parked outside the largest one, a tower of steel and tinted windows that reflected the sky with no warmth. He stepped out, with Max following close, and felt the weight of the past settle around him. Inside the building, the air was cool and still. The polished floors reflected the lights overhead, and the corridors stretched long and silent. People in tailored suits passed by without glancing at him. Their expressions held a practiced detachment that reminded Jake of officers who measured lives in numbers rather than names. He felt a flicker of the helplessness he had known on the battlefield when equipment failed and soldiers paid the price. His breathing tightened, but he forced himself to move forward. Max walked beside him steady and grounded a quiet anchor against the unease rising inside Jake. A receptionist escorted him to the top floor. The office was large, with dark wooden panels and a wide window overlooking the city. Behind a desk sat Richard Hale, the CEO. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair combed back neatly and a face shaped by years of command and corporate discipline. His blue eyes were cold and assessing. His suit was perfectly pressed, and his posture straight with the kind of confidence that comes from power rarely questioned. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and distant. Jake sat across from him with Max resting at his feet. He placed the envelope of documents on the desk. Hale raised an eyebrow, a faint expression of curiosity and impatience. Jake explained the truth about Maple Hollow, the quarry collapse, the hidden journal, and the evidence that the original company had ignored safety warnings. He kept his tone measured, but each word was sharpened by memory. Hale listened with a practiced neutrality, but his fingers tightened slightly on the arms of his chair. Jake felt the old pain rising again. Memories of friends dying due to equipment failures flashed before him. The weight of helplessness tightened in his chest, but Max pressed his head gently against Jake's leg, grounding him. Jake continued speaking, laying out the evidence with a calm firmness that surprised even him. Hale tried to dismiss some points with vague statements about history and lack of relevance, but the document spoke louder than his deflections. Jake watched the man's expression shift from impatience to concern, then to a stiff, calculating silence. Jake leaned forward and stated clearly that the truth would be made public if necessary. He told Hale that Maple Hollow deserved restoration and acknowledgement. The town had suffered because of actions taken long before, but the responsibility remained. Hale looked out the window for a long moment. His face softened only barely, as if some part of him understood the scale of the wrong, though he would never admit it aloud. At last, he agreed to sign a restoration agreement. The corporation would invest in rebuilding Maple Hollow, including supporting community services and repairing the old stone house and surrounding area. It was not charity. It was accountability. Jake watched him sign the document. His hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was something closer to release. Max looked up at Jake with calm, trusting eyes. Jake reached down and touched the dog's fur, feeling steady for the first time in many years. They walked out of the office together, leaving the cold hallways behind. For the first time since inheriting the house, he felt the faint beginning of hope. Morning light settled softly over Maple Hollow with a pale gold glow spreading across the rooftops. The air was cool and dry, carrying the crisp scent of early winter. Thin clouds drifted slowly across the sky, casting faint shifting shadows on the old stone house. Jake Turner stood outside with Max beside him and looked at the structure that was slowly transforming from a burden into a promise. The restoration agreement had been signed, but the reality of what lay ahead weighed heavily on his shoulders. Construction equipment sat scattered across the yard. Most of it was old with peeling paint and rattling joints that announced their age every time they moved. A few volunteers from the town had agreed to help, but they were inconsistent. Many were older men who remembered the quarry tragedy and felt torn between hope and distrust. Their faces, lined with years of hardship, often reflected quiet skepticism each time they surveyed the site. Jake understood their doubt. He carried enough of his own. Inside the house, the ground floor had been cleared of debris, revealing worn stone walls that seemed to have absorbed decades of silence. The plan was to create a community shelter here, a place where families could stay during emergencies. The upper floor would become a small training center for trades that might bring new opportunities to Maple Hollow. Jake had agreed to oversee the project not because he felt qualified, but because he felt obligated. The truth he uncovered had tied him to this place. His promise to himself would not let him turn away. Jake worked early each morning, shifting materials, hauling supplies, and coordinating deliveries that often arrived late or incomplete. He wore the same heavy work coat patched at the elbows, and his hands were rough from long hours of labor. At night, he changed into his mechanic uniform and drove to his night shift at a repair shop on the edge of town. The work was loud and exhausting, but it kept the lights on and allowed him to fund small necessities for the construction site that the delayed support had not provided. Fatigue seeped into him in slow, relentless waves. Each day felt like walking through thick mud. He tried to stay focused, but memories crept back when he was most tired. He saw the faces of soldiers he had treated on the battlefield, the way their eyes searched for comfort when he had little to offer. He remembered the helplessness that had carved deep grooves inside him, grooves that now threatened to reopen as the project faltered. He feared failing this town just as he felt he had failed men who once trusted him. The pressure grew heavier with each unfinished task. Delays from the corporation worsened the strain. Materials promised for early November arrived 3 weeks late. Forms that required signatures were returned unsigned. Excuses from office staff flowed in smooth, polished tones that offered no solutions. Jake clenched his jaw each time he listened to another empty promise. Anger simmered quietly beneath his exhaustion. Yet he knew anger would not build walls or repair roofs. So he pushed through the resentment and kept working with whatever he had. Max became the quiet strength at his side. The German shepherd, who carried a thick black and tan coat, stayed near him throughout the day. Max's steady amber eyes followed Jake with unwavering focus. When Jake hammered beams into place, Max rested nearby. When Jake collapsed onto a crate in exhaustion, Max approached, slowly pressing his warm head against Jake's hand. That simple touch grounded him. It reminded him that he was not alone. Max never needed words. His presence carried a calm certainty that Jake borrowed each time his own resolve faltered. Some evenings, Jake sat on the unfinished staircase inside the house, staring at the dark corners where new wiring would eventually run. His hands trembled from tiredness, and a hollow ache spread across his chest. It became hard to believe that the project would ever be finished. Doubt circled in his mind, whispering that he should let someone else take over. He was only one man lacking money, time, and energy. The town's skepticism echoed in his thoughts. The corporation's delays felt like deliberate obstacles, the weight of everything built into a knot inside him. But each time he reached that breaking point, Max appeared and sat beside him. The dog did not demand anything. He simply leaned in close, offering quiet companionship. Jake felt the warmth of Max's fur against his arm and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Something in that presence softened the hard edges of Jake's thoughts. He lifted his hand and rested it on Max's back, feeling the solid, reassuring weight beneath his palm. In those moments, Jake found a small spark of strength enough to stand up again and keep going. One night after finishing a long shift at the repair shop, Jake returned to the construction site. Moonlight fell across the stone walls, giving them a faint silver glow. He sat down on a pile of lumber and closed his eyes. His entire body felt like it was held together by threads. Max walked over and rested his head in Jake's lap. Jake stroked the dog's ears slowly. His voice was barely above a whisper as he admitted to himself that he wanted to quit. He wanted to sleep for days and forget the burdens that had piled up one by one. But the image of Maple Hollow rose in his thoughts. Children walking past boarded windows. Elderly residents moving slowly down cracked sidewalks. Faces marked by long years of disappointment. The people had lived with silence and uncertainty for far too long. And Max had shown him the truth behind the wall, a truth that demanded justice. Jake realized that giving up would betray not only the town, but his own journey to confront the past. He took a deep breath, feeling its weight move through him. He would continue. The next morning, he returned to work with a quieter but steadier resolve. The project was still slow. Supplies still lagged. Doubt still existed among the townspeople. But Jake kept going, guided by determination that grew each time Max nudged him forward. The house in Maple Hollow began to change, slowly, stone by stone under hands fueled by exhaustion, yet held together by purpose. Morning sunlight spread gently across Maple Hollow, casting a warm glow over the small town. The sky was clear, with only a few thin clouds drifting lazily above the distant hills. A soft breeze moved through the streets, carrying the scent of fresh paintwood shavings and new beginnings. The old stone house, now transformed, stood proudly at the edge of town, its once cracked walls restored and its windows gleaming with quiet strength. The building felt alive in a way that no one in the town had seen for decades. Jake Turner walked across the courtyard with Max beside him. The German shepherd moved with calm, confident steps, his coat shining in the early light. Jake paused briefly, taking in the sight of the finished structure, the Stone Haven Community and Relief Center. The name chosen by the town seemed to settle gently into his heart. He felt a deep sense of weight lifting from his shoulders, though exhaustion from months of labor still lingered in his muscles. Every scar on the stone spoke of effort, of setbacks, and of stubborn determination that refused to fade. Inside the building, volunteers made final adjustments, arranging chairs and checking emergency supplies. Many of them were residents who once doubted the project. Now their expressions held something new, a mixture of gratitude and quiet pride. Jake watched them work from a distance. His hands remained still at his sides, but his heart moved with a slow, overwhelming ache. For months he had wondered if any of this mattered. Now there was no doubt. The building was no longer a burden. It was a sanctuary waiting to open its doors. As the day grew brighter, families began arriving. Some walked with slow, careful steps, older residents who remembered the quarry collapse and the grief it had brought. Their faces lined with years of loss softened as they approached the restored house. Others were younger, carrying children or holding hands with friends. Their eyes shone with curiosity and hope. Jake greeted them quietly, offering small nods and faint smiles. He had never been a man of big speeches or dramatic gestures. His life had shaped him into someone who spoke more through action than words. One elderly woman approached him. She had pale gray hair pulled into a loose bun, and her frame was thin but steady. Her eyes, though tired, carried a warm depth. She thanked him softly for what he had done for the town. Jake listened and felt a painful mix of humility and sorrow rise within him. He remembered the faces of men he had lost on battlefields far away. He remembered feeling helpless as they slipped beyond his reach. Now, here in Maple Hollow, he saw families who had also lost loved ones to a different kind of tragedy. Their grief felt familiar. Their healing felt shared. Max stayed close to Jake, sensing the quiet storm of emotions moving through him. The dog occasionally nudged his hand as if to steady him. Jake responded by resting his palm on Max's back, letting the warmth of the dog's presence ground him. Max had guided him through fear, through exhaustion, and through moments when surrender felt easier than continuing. Jake knew that this building would not exist without the dog's unwavering intuition and loyalty. Max had led him to the hidden truth. Max had kept him steady when everything felt too heavy to bear. Max had been the constant in a world Jake had struggled to trust. During the opening ceremony, townspeople gathered in a wide arc outside the building. A simple ribbon had been stretched across the entrance. Chairs had been arranged, though many chose to stand. Their voices quieted as the mayor, a middle-aged man with a calm, kindly face, stepped forward. He spoke slowly about the town's long years of struggle and how this center would become a place of safety learning and support. His voice carried warmth as he explained the programs planned for Stonehaven: training workshops for young workers, emergency lodgings during storms, a shared kitchen for community events. As he spoke, Jake listened in silence, feeling each word settle into his chest like a soft, steady heartbeat. When the mayor finished speaking, he gestured toward Jake, inviting him to step forward. The crowd turned to him with expressions filled with gratitude. Jake walked to the front, feeling the weight of their attention. He did not speak. He simply bowed his head slightly and placed his hand on Max's neck. The gesture said everything he could not. The crowd understood. Applause rose gently at first, then grew stronger, filling the air with a sound that felt warm and healing. Jake felt his throat tighten, but he held steady, grounding himself in Max's presence. When the ribbon was finally cut, children rushed inside, followed by families curious to see the restored rooms. The training area upstairs filled quickly with voices of young adults, pointing at tools and equipment. Downstairs, volunteers showed emergency supplies and quiet sleeping spaces. The building felt alive with movement and hope. Jake stepped aside and watched from the entrance. Max sat beside him, calm and alert. The sunlight framed the doorway, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. Jake took a deep breath, feeling a peace he had never expected to find. For the first time since returning from war, the ache inside him eased. The town had been hurt. He had been hurt. But here in this house, rebuilt with sweat and persistence, something inside him finally began to mend. He was still a soldier, but now his mission had changed. He saved lives not on a battlefield, but in a quiet town where people needed a place to stand together. Stonehaven had become that place, and Max had been the quiet compass guiding him toward it. As families continued to fill the rooms, Jake looked down at Max with a soft, grateful expression. Max looked back with steady amber eyes. In that silent exchange, Jake understood his journey had meaning beyond the walls of the house. Love and loyalty had rebuilt not only a home, but also the fragments of a life shaken by war. Maple Hollow had gained a sanctuary, and Jake Turner had finally found a path toward peace. In the end, the story of Jake and Max becomes a quiet reminder that healing often begins in the places we once feared were beyond repair. A broken house was rebuilt through steady hands and faithful hearts, and in that work, a broken man found his own path back to hope. When a community comes together, even slowly and imperfectly, lives can be lifted and stories can be rewritten. Sometimes the smallest act of courage becomes the spark that lights the way for many others. And in moments of doubt, it is often the loyal presence of a friend that carries us forward. As you finish this story, remember that grace often appears in simple forms, in a kind word, in an unexpected helper, or in a door that finally opens. Some call it a miracle. Some feel it as the quiet touch of God moving through everyday life. May this message encourage you to look for the good around you and to become part of it. If this story warmed your heart, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And may God bless you and guide you with peace and strength each day.